Did you know that 81% of data breaches are caused by weak password security? Keeper Security's easy-to-use password manager platform keeps your passwords safe, easy to share, and out of reach of cybercriminals. Keeper is the leading cybersecurity platform for preventing password-related data breaches and cyber threats. Check out Keeper and get a free 3-year Keeper Password Manager solution when you take a demo of Keeper for Business. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Keeper Security. Whether your biggest cybersecurity concern is ransomware, unprotected network devices, zero trust success, or auditing your supply chains, firmware security is critical. Eclipsium's enterprise firmware security platform helps you identify devices and their firmware, verify the integrity of firmware wherever it's used, and fortify firmware through active remediation and automated patching. Visit securityweekly.com/Eclipsium to try out Eclipsium or learn more about enterprise firmware security.
And welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Herjavec, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Plus, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on Digital Pass registration. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 to register now. And we're back. The second interview here is all about the importance of identity detection and response, or IDR for short. This interview is sponsored by TiVo Networks, and today we've got Joseph Salazar with us to talk about this relatively new area of detection and response. Joseph has over 20 years of military and civilian experience in InfoSec. He's a retired major from the U.S. Army Reserves, where he spent 22 years as a counter-intel agent, intel officer, and cybersecurity officer. He's been a sysadmin, incident response analyst, SOC manager, and has done some computer forensics. And he's currently a technical marketing engineer for TiVo Networks. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's a great background. It's funny because I zero military experience here, but as far as the actual technical stuff and some of the roles you're in, I've had kind of a similar history, and I think a lot of that's going to play into what we're talking about today. So we've seen network, NDR, endpoint, EDR, I've even seen threat, TDR. But you're saying that we need to focus for detection and response on identity as well.
That's correct. And the reason why is because there are a lot of solutions that are out there that focus on all the other assets, and yet identity, an enterprise identity, is one of the most critical assets in an organization because it's how attackers can impersonate somebody, move around, gain access. And yet there aren't, until recently, too much focus. There aren't really too many solutions that focus on identity as an enterprise asset, and it's not a complete strategy, security strategy, if you're not focusing on identity security. And I'm not talking about the mechanisms to authorize somebody. I'm talking about the actual identity as an asset.
Right. Yeah. And I think we've needed to have that conversation for a while, where I think some people are getting there, where the concept of asset is not necessarily something with an IP address or, a computing system, but, code bases can be an asset, data can be an asset, and certainly identity is an asset that's, that can be a very specific thing, like in an IAM system, your identity is definitely an asset in a very technical, in real sense in terms of data, and then in more of a, kind of a metaphor, ephemeral sense, your identity stretches across a whole bunch of different systems. And I think that's where some of the complexity comes in here, right? Like how you would gather the information you need to do detection of attacks against an identity and have some kind of response capability.
Yeah, and I think it's people have a misconception about what existing security controls can actually do regarding identity, right? I mean, because we've seen, and I'll bring it up when I show some of the slides later. I mean, we've seen the prevalence of attacks, and a lot of the really successful attacks take advantage of an enterprise identity. It's how SolarWinds happened. It's how a lot of the recent breaches have happened. It's an attacker getting a hold of an enterprise identity, using the privileges available to that identity, moving around and getting where they want to go. And so it's really key, especially now with ransomware attacks on the rise. And ransomware is no longer just smash and grab, try to get as many, try to encrypt as many systems as possible and then go with it and try to get some ransom and a few $100s per system. No, that's not how ransomware works nowadays. Ransomware works by trying to go after your critical infrastructure. It's going to go after Active Directory. It's going to go after your production databases, anything that you are willing to pay millions of dollars to recover. Patient data from a hospital, for example, that gets encrypted. You're out of luck as a healthcare provider until you can get that data back. So it's, how much more are you willing to pay to get that back versus some endpoint that you can just wipe and start from scratch. And today's ransomware attackers are using advanced tactics that APTs and other advanced attackers have used to steal identities, move around, escalate privileges, find that critical target, find that high value asset, and then encrypt it.
Right. So with EDR, kind of the core of EDR is going to be an agent that sits on an endpoint. The core of NDR is going to be a sensor that sits on a network, usually not in line. It gets some kind of tap or copy of network data. What's kind of the core here for IDR? Where do we capture this data? Where does this system actually live?
So, and that I think that's where it would be good for me to go ahead and show the slides. And the reason why I say that is because
go for it.
Identity as an asset isn't just simply, for example, it's not just find something and protect it, right? So let me sort of explain what IDR really is, and the reason why. And let's start first with the whole point behind needing IDR, right? Let's talk a bit about that identity security gap. So attackers target credentials and all the associated privileges and entitlements to get into a network, to access those network resources. And if you just look at these stats, and this is all like recent research, right? This is all recent data. Most of these stats point out that it's all about the credential, and that credential is the key to an identity. And I say identity, not credential, because in the cloud, an identity can be a user, it can be a serverless function, it can be a storage bucket, it can be anything. And so we use the generic term identity rather than credential because identities get entitlements, and those entitlements allow them access to things. That's the permissions or privileges that you get. Now, with valid credentials, with valid identity, attackers can access any system, steal data, they consume resources, they can install ransomware, they can even escalate privileges to unlock other network resources. And this is where the gap in traditional security defenses shows up, right? So typical in-network security controls focus on securing the endpoint and then implementing access controls to prevent unauthorized access into the network, right? That's where you get your least privileges, minimal number of privileges that you need, entitlements that you need to access a resource, right? But until recently, no security controls focused on identities as a critical enterprise asset. And this gap is what attackers are exploiting to steal credentials, impersonate those identities, and gain access. So identity security closes this gap, and it provides continuous visibility and detection for attacks targeting identities, such as stealing credentials from endpoints, exploiting Active Directory exposures, compromising authentication mechanisms like MFA. And yes, there are MFA bypass techniques. So that's the point of identity security. Let's look at the identity as a critical asset and protect that. And that means protecting the mechanisms around the identity. So we're not talking just IAM and PAM. We're talking Active Directory. We're talking where the credentials live in your environment. So let's talk a little bit about IDR. So protecting identities involves several different facets, right? So let's start from the right. Identity Access Management, or IAM. That's responsible for managing, authenticating, and authorizing users to network resources. IAM really is to make that 80 admin's job easier, right? Most organizations already have this in place. You are protecting the identity by protecting the access to the resources and the authentication mechanisms, right? But the next piece is visibility to identity exposures across the enterprise, whether it's credentials on the endpoints, vulnerable Active Directory settings or parameters like admin SD holder, ACL, or hidden SIDs, things like that, or even identity risks and entitlements exposures in the cloud. Because again, an identity across the enterprise will have access to on-premises and cloud resources. And then there's the attack detection piece, which is what IDR really focuses on. And that's to try to flag activities trying to exploit identities such as credential theft, maybe a DC sync or a DC shadow attack, or attempts to access key vaults in the cloud and to compromise a certificate. The idea is to detect those activities early enough so that you can stop the attacker before they can get too far. So if you look at that entire gamut, you have access management, protect the mechanisms that and protect the access to the network. You have visibility, find the things that an attacker can exploit and get rid of them. And then you have detection and response. Detect the attacks when attackers do try to exploit those credentials or those identities and stop them before they can get too far. So organizations need all three of these things to actively secure an identity. So let's talk a little bit about visibility. So visibility enables organizations to efficiently understand exposures and attack paths from endpoints to Active Directory and the cloud by giving you insight into these things, right? Exposed passwords, credential attack paths, Active Directory exposures and vulnerabilities, again, like bad settings or parameters that allow an attacker to escalate privileges, and even just exposures and entitlements for over-provisioning in the cloud. Interesting fact, 90% of entitlements never get used, and yet a user ID, an identity, still has them. So imagine an attacker getting a hold of this thing where a user got an entitlement to a resource to use one time, and then they forget to remove it. That attacker now has access to all of those entitlements, 90% of which the user has never used because of an inheritance or belonging to a group. So let's talk about IDR. IDR is all about the organization detecting and responding to identity-based attacks very efficiently, right? So you want to look for credential misuse, privilege escalation, lateral movement. You want to protect credentials, privileges, and the systems that manage them. You want to deflect or detect credential theft and misuse and unauthorized AD queries. Fun fact, as an attacker, when I did red teaming, all I had to get was to get onto one system on an endpoint, and I can enumerate all of Active Directory. I can find every target, find all of the high-value systems, find the credentials that I wanted to steal to escalate to a domain administrator with a tool like Bloodhound or Mimikatz. However, let's just make something clear. It does not replace single sign-on or MFA, and it complements existing EPP and EDR solutions. They have their place. So EPP, EDR, NDR, XDR, TDR, they have their place. IDR is specifically for identities. So here's another thing that most people don't realize is EDR protects endpoints from compromise, but it doesn't protect the identities on that endpoint. So if you're storing a credential in a browser, or you're storing it in the Windows Credential Manager, or the Apple keychain, EDR does not protect that, right? It does not protect the identities on the endpoint. It doesn't prevent an attacker from moving laterally or detecting an attacker using it to access Active Directory. But IDR solutions do. However, the space is still relatively new. So, below are some samples of companies that provide these solutions. So you have Tenable, and they're in the space because they acquired a company called Alcid, which is a European company. CrowdStrike is in the space because they recently acquired a company called Preempt. And then there's Ativo Networks, which offers several solutions focused on identity security. So all of these, the space is growing as people realize that identity as a critical enterprise asset is something they need to focus on protecting. So this is a good place to stop. Any questions on what I just showed you?
Yeah, that's a. Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
Sorry to jump on you there, Adrian. So, quick question or two for you, Joe. Talk to me a little bit. The way I understand what you've discussed is it's more about focusing on the use, behaviors, actions at an identity-centric level, as opposed to looking at it from a endpoint-centric, network-centric, or app-centric level. Is that a good way of just kind of summarizing a 30,000-foot view?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Focus on the identity as an asset that you need to protect rather than looking at it from the endpoint view or from the network view, right? Because an attacker needs an identity to access anything in the network. It's how they get around. It's how they can move laterally. It's how they can identify targets. The identity is a critical component to any major attack. And so why not protect it as such?
Yep. Yep, totally agree. So then from a detection, visibility, observation, and analysis vantage point, the data you collect will be all centered around permission requests, usage of permissions, elevations of permissions, activities that would be centered, say, on, I guess, actions that are not in the norm. Is that a good way to think of the identity from the vantage point of the data we collect to then analyze to then provide protections around?
Well, so one thing is that we don't collect data to do this type of detection. At least a lot of the IDR solutions will look at it two ways. First of all is the visibility piece. So the visibility piece is finding out what you're actually vulnerable to. And to do that, you do things like Active Directory assessments. And we're not talking an audit, right? Because audits only find specific things and they're only looking for specific things. When we talk about assessments, we're looking at different things. We're looking at what is vulnerable in your Active Directory that an attacker can use. So let's pull up some examples. There is an access control list called admin SD holder. Admin SD holder controls access to all built-in objects within an Active Directory controller. That includes things like the domain admins group. So an attacker can add an ID, a user ID, any user ID, no matter the type of user, to the admin SD holder access control list if they have right access to it. And with that access, they can now add anybody to the domain admin group and you would never know. Let's talk about a hidden SID attack. A hidden SID is when you add a security identifier, a SID, to an existing account. So an attacker would go and look for a disabled admin account. Like typically the default admin account is going to have a SID and it's going to end in -500 in Active Directory. So all the attacker has to do is look for that disabled account, add that SID to an existing user account as a hidden SID, and then act as a domain admin. He doesn't belong to a domain admins group, but he has all the rights and privileges of a domain admin. How are you going to find that? Those are the types of weaknesses we're talking about.
Okay. So it's more centered around the management systems, the operational technology tools that run the identity components, as opposed to looking for behavioral action.
Yes, we're focusing on the systems that actually implement identity within the environment. And so that's the visibility piece. The other side of that is the detection and response, right? And detection and response is important because even if you reduce the exposure to the minimal you need to operate, you're still going to, as a business, accept certain risks by having certain high-value accounts with high-value privileges. You can't get rid of all your domain admins. Even if you separate the user accounts to have a regular user account and then a domain admin account, which is, typical good, that's just good policy, and that's just good, proper way of doing things, keeping an admin account secure from a regular user account, right? Even if you still have that, you're accepting the risk that that domain admin account is not going to get compromised. So what you need now is you need to find a way to detect when an attacker is attempting to compromise those high privileged accounts. And that's where the detection and response piece in IDR comes in, right? You need to be able to find and identify credential theft, privilege escalation, any type of discovery on Active Directory that could indicate that someone is data mining AD to find those privileged accounts, service accounts, shadow admin accounts, because that's one of the biggest headaches that an organization can have from a security perspective is shadow admins, right? Delegated permissions, delegated privileges on accounts that give them admin-like privileges without actually being an admin, right? The ability to change a user's password is huge. As an attacker, I get a hold of someone that has the change password delegated right. He's not an admin, but he can change any user password. I'll just find a DBA, change their password, and then look at all of the data that's on that database. So you need to find some way to detect those activities.
So a few questions about how, I guess, functionally you go through implementing this product. Is there any, as part of the deployment, does the product, you said it doesn't do an audit, but do you look for any, does it discover, settings, configurations that are, not best practices or things that typically get people in trouble? Are you looking for things that have already happened, or is it something where once it's in place, it's looking, that those detections from that point on are looking for activity that looks fishy?
Okay, so I can speak generally about other products, but there are certain things that are specific to our product in the IDR space. So when I start referring to that, it's I don't want to pump up the product. I want to talk about the the category of IDR, but there are certain things that only we do. So from my perspective, and my product is, our product is the only one that I have experience with. When we do an assessment, so let's talk about the visibility piece first. When we do an assessment, what we're looking for is existing misconfigurations, parameters, settings in Active Directory that attacker can exploit. So we call those exposures. Right, and so other products will do a certain number of checks to look for exposures. We do approximately 200 different checks to look for approximately 70 exposures, which I think is at or near the top of the list of the total number of exposures that actually people look at. Other solutions do, and then we will identify those as whether they're high, medium, or low risks. Right, and then depending on how you want to do it, you can schedule it to run as often as you want. You can schedule it to run ad hoc whenever you want to. And every time we get a new assessment, we'll identify new exposures, and we will identify, whether an exposure has been cleared or not when it disappears from the list. And so the idea is to keep that continuous visibility on Active Directory so that the exposures don't get out of hand. But the other part of that is detecting when something is happening in the environment that shows up on the domain controller. And that's when you have live attack detection, which is, I think, something only we do, on the domain controller at least. And actually, I think we're the only ones who do Active Directory attack detection at the endpoint, but I may not be correct on that. So, if you get mass changes, like you see sudden mass account lockouts or things of that nature, that could be indicative of a brute force attack. Right, you'd like to know about that, right? Before you start getting calls from users saying, "Hey, my account's locked out. What's going on?" Right, and those tend to be delayed quite a bit, versus getting an immediate alert that, "Hey, we just had about 30 accounts get locked out in this OU. You should probably check it out right now." Right, so do the assessment and then continually monitor for any changes that could make your life harder, that an attacker could take advantage of, and then look for signs that the attacker is actually trying to do something within your environment. So that's an example of one of our offerings doing that identity detection and the visibility piece as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of my big frustrations about when I used to be a pen tester is that I often felt like the clients would focus on the wrong things. So they would focus on maybe the exploit that I used to get in. We need to patch that vulnerability. Sure, but you also should have seen when I turned off AV on all these systems, I created a domain admin account. I was logging into all these other, like all that activity, like nobody noticed that it happened. Like that's kind of a bigger problem because there'll be a new thing that's not patched tomorrow. You need to be able to see this stuff going on.
Yeah, and that's really the funny part because when we start talking about AD queries from the endpoint, right? I mean, an AD query, only certain people should be doing AD queries, right? I mean,
right,
if
manual
you're an admin,
ones, absolutely.
You're an admin, you're going to be doing AD queries, right? But a regular user in HR or finance shouldn't be running PowerShell or command line and running nltest/dsgetDC to get a list of all the domain controllers that are in the environment. They should never be doing that. And
that's the frustrating thing, right? Like every time we see ransomware, they delete shadow copies. Like there's certain things that the attacker has to do to get their outcome, to get to their goal, that we know they're going to do. So why don't we have detection set up for it?
Yeah, and part of that is the tricky part, is the trickiness, right? It's like, how many EDR platforms or solutions or agents do you know that can actually detect someone typing nltest space/ds-getDC in a command line?
Yeah, we're just starting to test XDR solutions right now. So I'll let you ask me that question again in a month.
I can tell you that very few of them do, because it's part and parcel of how Active Directory works, right? A regular domain joined system has full access to query Active Directory. It's how Active Directory works, right? They need access to AD, or else they can't function. How else are they going to check to see if a service account is authorized access using a service principal name, right? To authorize access to that ID or that user or that service, right? You need the regular systems to talk to Active Directory. So an attacker that's running a query is gonna blend into the background, right? So unless you're looking for that specific type of activity and you have ways of detecting that type of activity, it's very difficult to detect it. And so, we've got one way of doing that. Other organizations, other vendors are looking for different ways to do it. But we can honestly say that since we've deployed our technology in pen tests and red team exercises, the blue team hasn't lost. So
that's very good to be able to say, because one of the observations I've been making lately, like looking through how some of these extortion campaigns occur, they really look like, we used to say pen tests weren't as useful because pen testers would emulate other pen testers, not adversaries. But
yes.
Now, like the folks that these ransomware crews are hiring are trained pen testers. Like they went through the same pen tester training that other folks did. They probably have certifications and stuff in pen testing, and these look like garden variety pen tests. So here we are. We came full circle.
Yes. Well, and the interesting part is that, from a detection and response standpoint, right, if you're looking at identity as an asset and you're looking specifically for solutions that protect identity as an asset, right, which is something you should be doing, the attacker really loses major leverage, right? If they can't access an identity, if they can't, for example, use something like Bloodhound to extract objects from Active Directory and identify the shortest path to a domain admin. If they can't do that, and that's in the discovery phase of the attack, where are they going to go from there? Right? Without an identity, an attacker has very limited options to penetrating a network.
So when you work with clients, with customers, is there a hardening phase of this? Is that a piece of this? Is IDR, is that part of IDR is doing some hardening, tightening up those identities, or is it more just focused on, the attack side of things?
No. So the IDR is the attack side of things, but the visibility piece, which is part of identity security, identity protection, that's important as well, right? So when you're doing the assessments, the idea is to identify those exposures and get rid of them before an attacker can take advantage of them. When you do an assessment in your lateral movement path from the endpoints, you want to remove all of the credentials that are stored there that you don't need to be stored there. Like an admin storing a credential on a regular endpoint is a big no-no. A domain admin doing that, that's a big no-no, right? But people do it out of convenience. So if you can reduce the attack paths from the endpoints, if you can reduce your attack surface exposure within Active Directory or in the cloud, if you can dial back the entitlements that a particular identity has in a cloud environment so that they only have the minimal number that they need to do their job and nothing more, that 90% of those entitlements that they never use, you're hardening your environment. You are reducing the addressable attack surface that an attacker can target so that they have fewer targets to go after. And then the IDR piece, which is the detection and response piece, that's when the IDR piece kicks in. That's when you now start actively looking for an attack activity that's targeting identities. So the few identity exposures and entitlement risks that you now have a way to detect when an attacker is attempting to exploit them.
So I'm sitting here wondering, as you talk about the hardening and the different attack vectors and how things can be exploited, which are all really awesome, if the average client of yours is at the same level of knowledge, or if you had to create training programs just to tell them how to properly secure things, so they actually understand what threats you're talking about and how this all ties together.
Oh, I wish I could pull up the console and show you right now. Here's the thing. We put a lot of help into our product so that if you don't know what a particular Active Directory exposure is, you click a details tab. We'll tell you of the full description of the exposure, the MITRE ATT&CK tactic that takes advantage of that, all the tools that are available to exploit it, plus how you can remediate it, as well as technical references on exactly why it's an issue on every single of these 70 or so exposures we have. So we put a lot of help into, at least from the visibility side. And then on the threat path side, the lateral attack path side, all of that is again, there's help available everywhere within our environment. And we do have professional services that can help you set all of that up if you want to and give you training. But the goal here is that, for most security people, once you point out, hey, here's the issue, here are the details, here's the remediation steps, they know where to go from there. And once they've done it a few times, it becomes simple. We actually just did. We're prepping for a webinar, and we did an assessment with the CISO who had had doing their due diligence, they do audits, they report to the board that, hey, yes, my Active Directory is secure. And when we started going through the assessment results, he found major gaps, and he's like, I didn't know this was happening. I mean, the admins know that they weren't supposed to be doing this thing, which is like accept an authentication from something within their finding, and I've reported to my board that they're not doing this, and yet here I see proof that they're doing it, right? And so he was surprised at the level of findings. We had a customer who had just done an audit and then brought us in, to do the demo for our product, and he said, he's like, I'm pretty confident you won't find anything. We just did an audit. We found 170 different findings that he was not aware of, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, and when I say 170 different findings, we're talking about exposures that identified multiple issues. Like, so a single exposure identified like 15 or 20 different issues that he had, right? And so, it's not difficult once you point them out, once you point to what they need to do for them to realize, hey, this is something I need to take steps to protect, and then to come up with a means, once we show them how to do it, to do that protection themselves.
Right. I was gonna, Joe, we're never getting rid of Active Directory, are we?
No, we're not. We're not.
Guess we'll have to secure it.
Well, as much as people want to move away from Active Directory, the reality is that over 90% of Global 1000 businesses use it. 90%. It's not going anywhere.
Pretty sticky, about as sticky a product as you can get. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, right? And if you consider where Microsoft started and what the key directory service was available at the time, and then for them to now have domain dominance, essentially, I mean, they have dominance of the market with Active Directory. It's actually rather remarkable, and yet, it's still one of the most insecure things I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/Ativo Networks to learn more. And we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.